If your nervous system feels tired and you're longing for a deeper, more embodied connection with the divine, I'd love to invite you to my free Sacred Intimacy Snapshot. In just a few minutes, you'll discover which area of intimacy in your life is asking for care right now, and you'll receive a gentle 4-part mini course to help you tend to what's next on your journey. You can take it at innerlightcompanion.com. Welcome to the Inner Light Companion, a space to personalize your spiritual journey with the 12 sacred intimacies. I'm Tamara Ridge, your companion and guide. Each episode of this podcast explores a facet of connection with the divine, yourself, others, and the world, offering clear markers to recognize, gentle practices to try, and stories that help you grow what's strong and tend to what needs to grow. Move at your pace and use the name for the holy that fits your heart. This isn't therapy or advice. It's a meeting of souls, a place to listen deeply, ask real questions, and remember the wisdom already within you. I invite you now to take a breath. Let's begin. Initially, I promised 2 episodes per week for this bonus series, but as I've moved through the holidays and really felt into the depth of this topic with you, I realized that this pace was not kind to my body or to my nervous system. So to honor the sacredness of this work and to show up with my full presence, I'm shifting the series to 1 bonus episode on Tuesdays for the next 3 weeks. This gives you more space to integrate, and it lets me continue this podcast sustainably for the long term. For most of my life, I believed that if I followed every rule and did everything quote unquote right, happiness was supposed to be the automatic outcome. When sadness kept showing up anyway, I took it as evidence that my faith was defective. When anger surfaced, I assumed it meant some dark influence was still there for me to overcome, rather than a human nervous system trying to tell the truth about what was hurting me. Even my thoughts felt high risk, like one wrong idea could undo my worthiness, my belonging, my entire spiritual life. So I learned to perform happiness while my body carried the weight of chronic anxiety and unprocessed grief. I smiled through lessons and testimonies while a tight chest, racing pulse, and a constant fear of getting it wrong lived under the surface of my skin. I said words that sounded certain on the outside, while privately wrestling with doubts that felt terrifying and forbidden. What it took years for me to name is this: that pattern was not spirituality. It was psychological harm dressed in religious language. It severed me from my own emotional reality. It distorted my sense of God, and it left my nervous system carrying a burden that it was never meant to bear. Today, we're talking about the invisible abuse that happens when a religious system teaches you that your emotions are the enemy, your thoughts are dangerous, and your psychological well-being is always secondary to compliance. This is the Inner Light Companion podcast. I'm Tamara Ridge, and this is episode 23 and bonus episode 12 of our Sacred Reclaiming Religious Freedoms series, Freedom from Psychological Harm. So first, I want to talk about 4 forms of psychological harm that occur in high control religions. I'm talking about Mormonism. However, these concepts apply to any high control religion. The first is emotional suppression and the denial of feelings. So I think my first example of how this causes psychological harm has everything to do with my experiences in abusive marriages. Because I was Mormon and had married in the temple at least once, I faked it a lot. I think it was more about my inability to see my own truth than purely external suppression. But the culture certainly didn't help. I pretended to be happy because I had all the things I was told should make me happy. The temple marriage, the house with the white picket fence, the adopted baby. But deep down, I was very unhappy. I was grieving in an emotionally disconnected marriage. I ignored my very appropriate anger, and I suppressed my sadness about how wrong my life felt, in spite of all of my efforts to do it right. Instead of feeling those emotions, I did what so many of us did in the church. I found other ways to soothe. One of the big unspoken ones, besides the forbidden self-pleasures that everyone worries about, is overindulgence in food. Food became a way to numb what I wasn't allowed to feel. And I have to say here that this also was a carryover for me from what had happened in my family of origin. And I think the way that people in high control religion use compulsive behaviors to deal with feelings that they don't know how to handle often are mirrored in their experiences from their family of origin. But for me, it was food. Psychological harm for me on the inside was suffering, pretending, using food as a compulsive behavior, while I smiled at Relief Society on the outside. In actuality, as a woman who was completely lost, out of touch with my own reality on the inside. And that's not uncommon from what you see in the church. So let me tell you what emotional suppression looks like in Mormon culture. Many people have identified, and I agree with this, that there are only certain emotions that were acceptable. Happiness, yes. Gratitude, yes. Enthusiasm for the gospel, yes. Testimony bearing joy, yes. But everything else, pushed down, labeled as spiritual failure. But you know what? Sadness, in that language of the culture, sadness is the same as lack of faith. Anger is the influence of Satan. Frustration means you're not praying hard enough. And doubt, that's spiritual danger. Happiness is enforced in the church. I remember being told, this is a gospel of happiness. If you're not happy, you must be sinning. Think about what that does to a child, to a teenager, or to an adult who's struggling with depression or grief. Another aspect of this psychological harm is the policing of joy, human experience of joy. So, for example, the temple oath requires avoiding loud laughter specifically. We couldn't even applaud in the chapel. Every natural human expression had to be measured, controlled, spiritually appropriate. You know, I've always had a loud laugh, and I often, when I was in the church, felt wrong when I let it out. As I'm doing my research for this episode, I saw that one woman, this really stood out to me. One woman was told by a leader that sadness was a feeling from Satan. And then she got a letter from her mom while she was serving her mission, telling her that that leader had unalived himself. When I hear this, the first thing I think about is that sadness, if that's a feeling from Satan, that leader must have been projecting and secretly belying his own struggle when he told somebody else that sadness comes from Satan. But because he could not overcome human emotions as he had wished to, he did what he did. There's something really wrong with that. So emotional suppression, that's what it creates. It creates the inability to deal with crisis. it leads to emotional arrested development. You lose access to your own feelings. And then you can't tell the difference between genuine peace and performed compliance. Your emotional vocabulary shrinks to fine and blessed when someone asks you how you are. It's so interesting because I've been talking recently about my nervous system reset, my nervous system coming alive as I've done this personal work because I'm finally safe. And when I look back, I would say I've been shut down, not feeling my feelings fully for 59 years. In all of that time, I honestly thought I was living in integrity. I thought I was feeling my feelings. But what I realized is that for my whole life, I've been performing. And it's pretty sobering to see that clearly. The good news is, and it is wonderful, I tell you this to underline something really important. When we've been trained to perform our spirituality and our emotions for most of our lives, I left the church at 43. It can take a really long time for the nervous system and for our real feelings to come back online. And that long shutdown, that's an impact of the psychological harm. So if you're just starting to feel again and it scares you, or if you feel numb and wonder what's wrong with you, I want you to know this is what religious trauma does to the nervous system. It's not a character flaw. It's an adaptation. The second area of major harm that's done in high control religion is induced fear, anxiety, and psychological trauma. Here's what the research shows about high control religion and mental health. 78% of people develop complex PTSD symptoms. 78%. 42% have elevated anxiety disorders versus 18% in control groups where people aren't in the high control religions. 38% experience depression versus 15% in control groups. It tells me that what I was seeing when I left the church wasn't a figment of my imagination. These aren't random outcomes. These are predictable results of psychological manipulation. Fear becomes the atmosphere that you breathe. You have fear of divine punishment, so every thought that you have gets monitored. Every impulse gets judged. There's fear that you might be unworthy, so you have constant anxiety about temple recommends, callings, standing before an eternal judge, fear of eternal consequences. One mistake could cost you your family forever. And fear of apostasy, where questioning is essentially the same as spiritual death. I believed for a long time that I didn't get the callings named in my patriarchal blessing because I was somehow unworthy in ways I couldn't detect. That kind of invisible oppression is so hard to carry. You can't see what you're doing wrong, but you're sure it's your fault. On top of that, being infertile in a baby production focused church made me feel like there was a key to a lock somewhere that I just couldn't find. It felt like there was something about me personally that was wrong, not just my circumstances, but me. Both of those things together meant that I didn't make many friends. I felt that I wasn't as good as the people around me. I didn't speak up when I should have. I couldn't relax in the quiet moments where I was alone. And sometimes I even avoided God altogether, which only made me feel more guilty because it felt like God was keeping a secret from me. And I was the one person who wasn't allowed to know it. That's what psychological harm looks like from the inside. Not just, I feel sad, but I am less than, I am disqualified. God knows what's wrong with me and isn't telling me. That belief gets into your bones. Research shows that perfectionism in Mormon culture creates two toxic patterns. The first one is discrepancy perfectionism. I hate myself if I'm not perfect. That's what I just described to you. And it's even more insidious when you can't figure out what's wrong, what's making me imperfect. I'm just not feeling a sense of belonging in a church where no one really feels that. And socially prescribed perfectionism. Others will hate me if I'm not perfect. People with toxic perfectionism are twice as likely to leave the church, not because they want to, but because the psychological cost becomes unbearable. Studies comparing Mormon members found that those with a legalism outlook, so that's a work-based worthiness, had significantly higher shame, anxiety, and depression than those with a grace outlook. But here's the tragedy. The system taught legalism and called it righteousness. At one point, I remember having a conversation with some non-Mormon Christians while I was still a member, and they told me, truthfully, you have a work-based worthiness, not a grace-focused outlook. And I'll tell you, I didn't even understand what they were talking about. I literally had no framework for a spiritual life that wasn't built on constantly earning my value. One researcher studying Mormon missionaries found that the culture of exact obedience that's in the mission field creates constant self-criticism, fear of failure, belief that worth depends on flawless performance. And as I say that, I think about if you believe in Jesus, that means that you don't have to be perfect because Jesus was. That's a fatal error in the Mormon church. And also the missionaries experienced, because of the exact obedience, scrupulosity is a word I just recently learned, which is religious OCD, where every action is spiritually scrutinized. It causes a lot of suffering. Prayer, scripture study, and the temple attendance no longer bring peace. They bring fear of punishment and feelings of condemnation. For me, I don't know if there was a clear moment when spiritual practices stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling like performance anxiety. I think it was more like spiritual performance slowly went hollow. I remember going to the temple once a month for years and years. It was the center of my spiritual life. And then one day it just felt empty. I sat there doing all the right things, saying all the right words. And inside it felt like there was nothing there for me anymore. But before I came to that conclusion, I also self-criticized. What's wrong with me that I can't feel anything here in the temple of God? Around the same time, I started to notice the people around me at church were performing spiritually too, smiling, bearing testimony, saying all the right things, while internally they were fearful. Listen, guys, I'm a marriage and family therapist. I've been doing the work for 30 years. Left the church 16 years ago, so halfway through my career. I can see fear when it exists. Relationships could only go to a certain depth. I was questioning and answering very difficult spiritual questions, and no one could meet me there. I'd never felt more alone, surrounded by people doing all the right spiritual practices. That's when I realized that my spiritual life wasn't actually bringing me comfort. It was becoming a performance I couldn't step out of without feeling like I was risking everything. Maybe you felt that too. The third area of psychological harm is shame and scapegoating. In 2018, former Mormon Bishop Sam Young collected over 800 testimonies from people traumatized by Mormon youth worthiness interviews. These interviews were conducted alone with an older male bishop, starting as young as age 8, with deeply personal, intrusive sexual questions and no pastoral or clinical training for bishops. Childhood abuse victims said the shame from these interviews created a perverse sense of responsibility for their abuse. I'm just going to pause for a second. Most children who are victims of abuse blame themselves. But in these circumstances, when it comes from a religious authority, it makes it even worse. Shame, guilt. One man reported attempting self-castration at age 13 and then again at age 14 because of the shame around touching himself. Another described it as horrifying, humiliating, degrading, embarrassing, and added that the experience left lasting trauma around sexual intimacy even decades later. The system teaches your private thoughts, your developing sexuality, your normal human experiences are all potential sins that need confessing to a male authority figure. It reminds me of an Alanis song. I don't know if you know Alanis Morissette. I do. I love her. But it reminds me of her song, Forgiven. I sang Alleluia in the choir. I confessed my darkest deeds to an envious man. It seems appropriate here. My experiences didn't come from youth interviews so much as from a specific confession, which I've shared before. Before I went to Germany, I went to my bishop and confessed the things I'd done with my boyfriend. Just one time in the back of my car. It wasn't some dramatic major sin. It was petting, touching, kissing, normal young adult sexuality. His response was to shame me. He told me that God wouldn't forgive me until I'd found myself in a similar situation again and proven that I could make the right choices. In other words, not only was what I'd done framed as serious sin, but my forgiveness was made conditional on a future test I couldn't predict or control. Even after that, and even years after I left the church, I carried this constant anxiety about breaking the law of chastity. I went to the temple when I was 21, and from then until I left, using my body as an expression of love and joy was incredibly difficult. There was this quiet, constant sense that physical pleasure, even inside a loving relationship, wasn't truly safe. And the truth is, that's still a tender place for me, even 16 years after leaving the church. Some of that sexual shame is still unwinding. That's what psychological harm does. It takes something completely human, touch, attraction, pleasure, and turns it into evidence that you're bad, that your body can't be trusted, that God is holding your forgiveness on layaway. And that message doesn't magically disappear when you walk out of the chapel for the last time. So if you've ever found it hard to relax into physical pleasure, even in a safe, loving relationship, or you still feel afraid that God is angry with you for things that were completely human, that isn't a sign that you're broken. That's the echo of sexual shame you were taught to carry. One of the most insidious forms of psychological harm is scapegoating, projecting shame and guilt onto others to avoid facing our own imperfections. In Mormon culture, this shows up as being released from callings, as public spiritual failure. It's cast that way even if you're asked to be released, or you're released because you're too tired or suffering too much to serve beyond what your bones will give. Ward councils discussing your private struggles, being made an example of, either positively or negatively. That happens a lot in Mormon culture. Before we continue, I want to name something. I've been creating a small space called Grace's World because I believe spirituality belongs with humanness, not above it. Grace's World isn't teaching or advice. It's just ordinary moments, mugs filled with hot drinks, mornings feelings that don't need fixing. If that sounds like something you'd like to sit with, you're welcome to visit. Just go to innerlightcompanion/Grace's World. And if you don't want to visit, that's completely okay. Let's continue. Having your name synonymous with struggling or less active. Personally, when I was released as the Spiritual Living Teacher and Release Society for going off the manual, it was after I had really prayed and pondered about what to teach the women. I brought a lesson that felt deeply inspired and alive to me. And the women in the room responded. You could feel it. The lesson landed. But within a week, I was released. And even though no one said you're being punished, it absolutely felt like public correction. The message was clear. You went off the script, and that's not okay. What it taught me was that I couldn't really speak up. It taught me that my authentic spirituality, my lived experience with the divine, didn't actually belong at church. And it left me with this long-standing confusion about where the line was between approved public spirituality and the way we're actually living spirituality in our real lives. Because if our real experiences with God can't be shared except inside heavily scripted, correlated testimonies, then what are we doing? It felt like I was being told, your relationship with the divine is not welcome here. Just read the manual. That's a form of psychological harm too. It teaches you that the most honest, intimate parts of your spiritual life are unsafe to bring into community. Over time, you learn to mistrust your own revelation and defer to the manual instead. The fourth way that psychological harm is accomplished in the Mormon Church is through constant criticism and humiliation. Now, people might say, wait a minute, I don't get constantly criticized and humiliated, but the surveillance culture in Mormonism means that you're always being evaluated. Worthiness interviews. Are you paying tithing? Are you sustaining local and general leaders? Are you keeping the word of wisdom? Are you morally clean? Also, home teaching. Your home teachers show up. They give reports back. They want to know who's attending, who's struggling. And then there are the ward councils where they're discussing members' private details under the guise of ministering. If you don't believe that that has an impact on your sense of psychological well-being, I found a quote from a former member. They said, at one point during a youth interview, I felt sick from anxiety and asked to leave, to go to the toilet, but they wouldn't let me. I felt as though I had a total loss of control. That person's body was telling them to get the hell out of there. But the control, the coercion, said no. The constant message is you're never good enough. You're always being watched. Your private life is community property. Even your successes have to be humble. You aren't allowed to be proud of anything you accomplish unless a church leader told you to do that thing that you accomplished. And then, even then, you had to give glory to God and the church. I didn't actually realize how constantly evaluated I'd felt until after I left the church. It was only once I was out that I discovered something really simple and really radical. My privacy was mine. No bishop, no worthiness interview, no ward council, just me. That's when I started to really enjoy a sense of freedom because suddenly there wasn't anyone constantly watching me and evaluating my actions. I didn't have to wonder what a leader would think about every decision that I made. I remember before I would go into the yearly Temple Recommend interviews, how strong my desire to have this person see me as good, when in truth, none of that mattered. Now I didn't have to pre-edit my life for potential interviews. And the most impactful piece of that was, after I left the church, I slowly learned to believe that God wasn't constantly scrutinizing me either. Not as a cosmic bishop taking notes for some future interview. Not as a surveillance system tracking every thought and impulse. For the first time, I could imagine a divine presence that wasn't watching me to catch me doing something wrong. Inside high control religion, constant surveillance gets spiritualized. Being watched, evaluated, and interviewed is framed as love, care, and accountability. But psychologically, it trains your nervous system to live in hypervigilance, always braced for judgment, never fully at ease. Leaving and realizing that your inner world actually belongs to you, that your thoughts, your emotions, your choices, and even your relationship with the divine are yours, is a massive piece of reclaiming psychological freedom. So now I want to name what this invisible abuse costs you. First, it costs your emotional vocabulary. After years of suppression, many ex-Mormons report that it takes months of therapy just to reconnect with feelings that aren't nice. One woman said, I was terrified that if my therapist heard me say anything negative, it would keep him from wanting to join the church. I was that brainwashed. That's another piece of policing that I haven't talked about, is the belief that is taught in church from the pulpits all the way from General Conference. Your neighbors are watching you. Show them how good you are. It's ridiculous and insidious and so harmful. It also costs you your nervous system regulation. Religious trauma isn't just psychological. It's stored in your body. Your nervous system gets stuck in fight mode, where you're constantly feeling defensive and irritable, or flight mode, where you're experiencing anxiety, panic, and a need to escape. Freeze mode, where you're experiencing dissociation, numbness, or shutting down. Or fawn mode, people pleasing, the inability to say no. If you remember episode 22, you might want to go back to that, where I talked about dorsal vagal shutdown or collapse and freeze, sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, activation in the nervous system. Both of those states get activated in high control religion when we want to stay in the ventral vagal state, where we're able to socially engage, feel safe, and connected. If you want to learn more about that, please go back and listen to episode 22. Research shows that people leaving high control religion experience a lack of trust in their own intuition, difficulty recognizing their own needs. Does this sound familiar? Emotional numbness, hypervigilance, unexplained physical symptoms. Since that 4-day reset of my nervous system that I talked about in a previous episode 22, what I've really started to see is this. Spirituality is lived in the body, not just in your beliefs, not just in your thoughts, but in your actual nervous system. When my body was full of fear, shutdown, and chronic dysregulation, it was incredibly easy for the church to maintain control. If your nervous system is stuck in survival, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, you will cling to external authority because you don't feel safe enough to trust your own inner world. But when the nervous system is regulated, when you can actually stay present in your body, you start to discover something dangerous to high control systems. You have a natural spirituality. You can feel your own connection with the divine. You can sense what's true and what isn't. You can notice when something feels off in your body, even if everyone else is calling it the spirit. And if the church didn't keep people in fear, if it didn't constantly threaten eternal consequences, worthiness loss, and social exile, most of us would eventually realize I already have a direct line to the divine. I can trust my own nervous system as part of that guidance. And if that's true, who needs worthiness interviews? Who needs to pay tithing out of terror? Who needs to outsource their spiritual authority to an institution? That's the subversive power of nervous system regulation. Once your body stops living in fear, you can begin to realize you never needed gatekeepers to reach God in the first place. Another cost of high control religion is your ability to trust yourself. When you're taught that your thoughts are dangerous, your emotions are from Satan, your questions are apostasy, your body's signals are temptation, you lose the ability to trust your own inner authority. You become dependent on external validation from leaders, from manuals, from worthiness interviews, to know if you're okay. It also costs you your mental health. The statistics on this are staggering. In high control religion, the statistics are there are much more anxiety disorders, depression, complex PTSD, OCD scrupulosity, eating disorders, suicidal ideation. And the system tells you that these struggles were your spiritual failure, not the system's psychological abuse. That's the ultimate manipulation. So let's talk about healing. How do you reclaim your psychological freedom? The first step is naming the abuse. That's why I have created this series. You cannot heal what you cannot name. Emotional suppression is abuse. Induced fear and anxiety are abuse. Shame and scapegoating are abuse. Constant criticism and humiliation are abuse. Say it out loud. What happened to me was psychological harm. Not just difficult, not just my faith journey. Harm. I started naming what happened to me as abuse fairly soon after I left the church. I remember angrily listing the things I could finally see and calling them abuse out loud. But very quickly after that, I shut my voice down again because it wasn't palatable to my family of origin. I even started a blog where I was going to keep venting my frustration and anger about the ways I felt oppressed in the church. And then I closed it down. I tucked it all back in. So for a long time, I carried the awareness, but not the language. I knew that something was deeply wrong, but I didn't feel like I was allowed to call it abuse. It wasn't until I started this podcast and really committed to speaking clearly about the abuses and about authentic spirituality that everything shifted. Once I let myself use that language out loud, this was abuse, not just my Mormon upbringing. My life opened up. I felt more joyful. I felt a grounded sense of spirituality that I had never experienced before. Naming the abuse didn't make me more bitter. It actually made me more free, more honest, and more connected to the divine than I had ever been. So name the abuse. Step 2, regulate your nervous system. Healing from psychological harm requires somatic practices because trauma lives in your body. Some practices that might help you are diaphragmatic breathing, where you lie on the floor and you make sure that your exhales are longer than your inhales, and you're putting your breath in your belly so that your inhale expands your belly like a balloon. Imagine blowing up a balloon in your belly as you breathe in. And then as you exhale longer, that balloon collapses. Another practice that helps is gentle movement, yoga, walking, dancing to release stored tension. Another practice is vagus nerve stimulation, cold water on your face, humming, singing, facial massage, and weighted pressure. So weighted blankets or having your pets on your chest. That leads to parasympathetic activation. You can also use grounding techniques where you notice 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear. Your body's been in survival mode for years, maybe decades. These practices teach your nervous system you're safe now. The third thing you can do to activate your healing is to reclaim your full range of emotion. Here's the truth the church never told you. All emotions are information, and none of them are from Satan. Sadness tells you something matters to you. Anger tells you that a boundary was violated. Fear tells you to pay attention. Grief tells you that you loved something you lost. I've taught my clients for years that feelings are a feedback mechanism. They tell us about ourselves, about our needs, our limits, our values, our environment. In some ways, I've always known that. I've always been highly intuitive, even while I was shut down. So for me, it wasn't that I discovered emotional wisdom for the first time. It was more that I finally let myself live by what I'd been teaching. One of the clearest mirrors of this came from a little girl I worked with years ago, soon after her father died. Her mother was doing the best she could with the tools she had, but she kept telling her children, Dad's in a better place, Dad's happy now, Dad is watching you from heaven, you should be happy. So these very young children tried to perform happiness even in the middle of profound grief because that's what they thought their mother and God wanted. One day, the 8-year-old little girl came into my office and something had shifted. She was lighter. The grief was still there, but it wasn't locked up in the same way. And I asked her, and she said she felt all better. I asked her what changed. Draw me a picture of what happened that made you feel better. And she drew a picture of her and me sitting together, and in the speech bubble, she wrote my words. It's okay to cry. That was the moment I saw so clearly how powerful it is to simply give permission for appropriate sadness. She didn't need a theology lesson. She didn't need to choose happiness. She needed someone to say, your feelings make sense. You're not wrong for having them. And that's true for us as adults too. When we stop trying to override our anger and grief with forced happiness, our emotions can finally do what they were meant to do, and that is to guide us. In many ways, that little girl's drawing was a mirror for me. It reminded me that I also needed someone, finally myself, to say it's okay to cry. It's okay to feel everything you feel instead of constantly performing spiritual happiness. So I invite you to practice. Say this. I feel sad, and that's okay. I feel angry, and that's information. I feel scared, and I'm listening to my body. The fourth step to reclaiming your healing after spiritual abuse is to rebuild self-trust. For years, you were taught to distrust your thoughts because doubt was the same as apostasy, your feelings because negative emotions weren't coming from God, your body because natural desires were sin, and your intuition because the spirit trumps your knowing. So rebuilding self-trust means you ask yourself, what do I think about this? Not, what would the bishop say? What does the manual teach? What would keep me safe from judgment? Notice your body's wisdom. Does this feel expansive or contracting? Does this bring me peace or anxiety? Is this my truth or someone else's? Give yourself permission to change your mind without shame, without needing to justify, and without owing anyone an explanation. Step 5 is process the trauma. For many, this requires professional support. Therapies that help with religious trauma include EMDR to help you reprocess traumatic memories. Many people, I'm surprised how many have never heard of it. It's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I do that kind of therapy myself. It's a really good, effective way. I would recommend that you find, if you look for someone to do EMDR for you, look for someone who can do attachment-focused EMDR. Because in my experience, that's the way to get the most effective healing. And there are people out there who are doing EMDR without certification, without proper training. So look for someone with attachment-focused EMDR training. Another one is internal family systems. They often call it IFS. There you would focus on healing your parts that were wounded by spiritual conditioning. Another one is somatic therapy, where you release trauma stored in the body. That's a lot of what my focus is when I talk about ventral vagal states, sympathetic activation, and dorsal shutdown. And narrative therapy, where you rewrite your story outside of the religious framework. Find a therapist who specializes in religious trauma and doesn't try to preserve your faith unless you want to. You need a therapist that validates that what happened to you was real harm. So now let's practice a reclaiming exercise that can help you ground. This has been a long, heavy podcast episode. I want you to put one hand on your heart and one hand on your belly. Take a slow breath in to the count of 4 and a longer breath out to the count of 6. Say out loud or in your mind, I give myself permission to feel everything I feel. My emotions are my friends. They are information. My thoughts are safe. They are mine. My body is a safe place. It is my home. Now, I want you to name one emotion that you've been suppressing. Just one. Maybe it's anger at what was done to you. Maybe it's grief for the years you lost. Maybe it's fear about who you are without the church. Say it. I feel whatever the emotion is. And I'm allowing myself to feel it. Notice what happens in your body. Does your chest tighten? Does your throat close? Do tears come? Don't stop it. This is your body releasing what it's been holding. Crying, shaking, trembling, sighing. Those aren't breakdowns. These are breakthroughs. Breathe. Stay present. Let your body do what it needs to do. You are safe. You are here. You are free. Here's what I know in my bones after 43 years of psychological harm and the journey to healing. The divine never needed your fear to love you. God didn't create you with a full range of emotions just to call half of them sinful. True spiritual intimacy doesn't require you to suppress your humanity. It requires you to bring all of yourself to the relationship. Paramahansa Yogananda taught that personal contact with God comes through direct experience, not through fear, not through worthiness interviews, not through performing compliance. Your anger isn't sin. It doesn't come from Satan. It's from you. Your doubt isn't apostasy. It's your soul seeking truth. Your grief isn't lack of faith. It's evidence that you loved deeply. The divine has been waiting for you to show up whole, not half hidden, not performing, not pretending. Freedom from psychological harm means that you finally get to bring your real self to the relationship with the divine. And here's the beautiful part. The divine has been loving that real self all along. For decades, I believed that being spiritual meant silencing half of my humanity. I learned that my emotions were dangerous, my thoughts were sinful, and my psychological well-being was always secondary to compliance. But healing taught me this. A system that required my compliance was the danger, not my voice. If you're listening to this and recognize yourself, if you've been performing happiness while dying inside, if you've been taught your emotions are from Satan, if you've carried shame that was never yours, I want you to know what happened to you was real. It was harmful, and it wasn't your fault. You are allowed to name it. You are allowed to grieve it. You are allowed to heal from it. And on the other side of that healing, you get to be whole, not half present, not performing, whole. Next week, episode 24, is bonus number 12, which is freedom of identity and self-development. Until then, I hope you reclaim every emotion you were taught to fear. May you trust the wisdom of your body, and may you know deep in your bones that you were always worthy of psychological freedom. Thanks for listening. As you step into your day, notice which intimacy stirred for you, and then choose one small practice and let it meet you where you are. You want support? Grab the free Sacred Intimacy Snapshot, and when you're ready, the full Sacred Intimacy Assessment that can guide your next steps. Links are in the show notes. Until next time, walk gently, listen deeply, and trust the light within.